David, to get us started, just anywhere today, uh, what is something that you have found to be true?
Mm. True. True is a word that seems to need more attention these days. And yet it's hard to say what true is, isn't it? I think, one thing I notice is that the experience of the body and our relationship to the world that we live through it um, seems to be increasingly, sort of needed as a verification of basic things we might assume are true. But I guess I've noticed that the digital world is creating so many more kinds of ways in which people can modify or falsify truth. But I think for the average person, you kind of know it in your body as true face to face in contact with one another. There's still something that feels important to us, and I think maybe even will increase in importance and value the more untrue the world starts to seem to us.
Yeah, the body is the only true thing we can know. It's the only thing under our possession, or is that not capturing it?
Well, I'm tempted by your summary of that to say, yeah, I agree with that. I think there's also this thing that people experience um, about their bodies, which is that our experience is incredibly subjective, and that there are also ways in which our body seems to confuse us, or we feel sensations that make us feel certain things that aren't always verifiable objectively in the world or by others around us. So there's a great deal of variability in what any given individual feels is true in our bodies and minds, but it's still the fundamental ground of our being. And so I'd say whatever we think is true is still going to have to pass through this through this lived experiential uh, way of being in the world. We can think and talk about a lot of stuff, but that all stands up on the lived experience, our senses, things we learned in our first 5 years before we could say any of it.
You're listening to Therapy for the World, an interview series with kind, thought-provoking people working along the spectrum of self-care and world care. I'm Dan, a writing therapist and teacher, and this is my conversation with David Marchant, dancer, educator, and movement researcher. We recorded this conversation in early 2024, so it's a bit outdated, but hopefully still fresh. Happy listening. David, you are a dance professional, have been for a long time. I met you through a class at university, Contact Improvisation, that
Mm-hmm.
I say lightly, but also very seriously was one of the most important classes I took during my university years. I told you off the air that it it helped bring to the body, as you're describing now, so much of political truth, philosophical truth, or attempts at truth in each of these disciplines. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering how you got involved in dance. I was reading that the first time that you auditioned for something, you were told, kind of unkindly, you're not very good, but we need men.
That's true. Yeah, and it is true. I think in dance as an art form, there are not many men in our culture who seem to be drawn to, or I don't know if there are gender fears or assumptions about what kind of person dances. I grew up I was in high school in the 80s. And so at that moment in the United States, we had some really robust and rapidly rising examples of men in dancing, and they included Michael Jackson. The album Thriller came out while I was a sophomore in high school and was massive to everyone and everything. It really changed the culture in ways that are difficult to precisely define or measure. But I was among the influenced, seeing, in addition to that, there were other movies at the time, things like Flashdance or Footloose, movie Fame. So there were these examples of men dancing that interested me. I had been an athlete. I was a swimmer for a decade at a serious level. And so I think, I had a pretty well established kind of kinesthetic intelligence, the ability to feel my body in space. Maybe there was even something about the tactility of water that gave me the refined proprioceptive feel of where am I and what's this doing?
Existing in a
So,
different space, the water to the air.
yeah, you actually feel yourself in pressure in relationship to it. And I don't think I appreciated at the time what that would mean to me in my life. But when I got to college, this interest in dancing that had been percolating just as a sort of a social thing in the background suddenly became an option. There were classes, and I could register, and I could learn, and I could take develop a technique for things that had just been fun. So I got really involved in it, and I seemed to get better at it quickly. But the other feature of what you're pointing out in your question is that I often was the only man in the room, and this gender differential still remains. I just came before this interview from my every spring semester introduction to dance as a contemporary art form. I got 22 people in the room, and 2 of them are men. Has not changed in 40 years.
Which is crazy.
Kind of. There have been classes that were different than that, almost even equal, but it's still pretty normal that more women have had either exposure to it when they were kids, and so we're more warm to it. Even the art form, quite frankly, like I'm in the tradition called contemporary or modern dance, which we can roughly attribute to artists at the beginning of the 20th century out of the United States, like Isadora Duncan, Ruth St. Denis, and then Martha Graham and Doris Humphrey. And you would notice that every name that I offer as like original founders of this art form are women. It's actually a women's led art movement, which is distinct from almost every other kind of art form we know. And so men gradually get involved in this story and are also significant artists, but it's just an interesting origin that this art form is still occupied a lot by women in the field of dance education.
Is that a modern phenomena, or would we look back to 3, 4, 500 years? Humans have been dancing since we've been around together, right? It's always been this activity that's taken center stage, literally in cultures. Was it always gendered there as well?
Well, that's an interesting thing too, because there are cultures in which, don't ask me to name particulars out of my memory, but there are cultures in which men, well, Japanese, for example, men would be the only permitted performers, even of the female roles in kabuki theater, for example. So, it kind of depends on where you are in the world and at what time. But I don't know. There's a lot of men dancing. I don't know about, but it seems to have been that the artistic branches, the concert art dances from Eurocentric traditions, even though ballet is credited as being started by Louis XIV in his court, um, ballet is still largely regarded as a feminine art. And so, but then there's the contemporary dance arc or branch that consider myself a part of, has a lot of men involved, but it's still something that seems to be this thing that just fewer of us are going to get involved in it. But I did, and about 40 years ago, started dancing in college in a class like the one I just taught today, and really grew to love it quickly. And the other thing about that is that my chosen brand of contemporary dance was also intriguing to me because you learn that it's a lineage of individual innovators and people who maybe study under and are influenced by others who came before. But then at some point, you're going to kind of inevitably branch out into creative innovation and discovery of your own voice and what seems to work in your body or what you're interested in or what way of moving seems to be the best vehicle for what you want to say or express. So today, contemporary dance is just this vast, diverse spectrum of individuals, people who follow them and maybe form companies and learn and study under them. But then the tradition will just keep emerging with people branching away into their own thing.
Is there
And so
something
it's really
that
difficult.
is there something that unites the practice then? Contemporary dance? Is there something that they have in common? Is it a specific, twirl of the arms or something else?
It's not what it looks like, and it's not the style. It's actually this outlook and approach that leads to new and ever branching individual creativity. So I find it beautifully diverse, intrinsically inclusive, that if there isn't a dance that suits you, you can make your own. And if you have enough tenacity and grit to do it, maybe you even form a whole new thing that didn't exist. All of the dance styles that are currently within this modern or contemporary dance tradition all started with somebody doing something nobody else had done before. And that includes the people who started experimenting with contact improvisation, the form that you encountered. That was another little sub-genre of people who actually didn't even have any formal dance training as we think of modern or jazz or ballet forms.
Which ended up being a strength for the contact improv movement, that it was not, that it didn't come from any formal background.
Well, it didn't have, I think because they weren't coming from formal trainings, they also didn't have previously established habits or expectations or ideas of what it would be.
So talk a little bit about what contact improv is. I think for someone who hasn't been through it, I'm speaking of it almost as though it's a transformation, but it felt that way insofar as the class does, the practice, it does teach you to regard other bodies differently, not just human bodies, of course, but also the floor and the air and the natural world around us, which is something we might be able to talk about later.
Yeah.
What is contact improv?
Well, so I think we can start with that they nicely gave it a very simple, descriptive, elusive name. Some dance techniques got named after their person founder, like Horton technique or Graham technique. And then you don't really know what that is, but contact improvisation. So it's an improvisational approach. That means that we start moving without having premeditated what kind of an outcome we want to repeat or achieve. Instead, we are entering into a kind of flow of moment to moment decisions that maybe on one hand seem to flow out of where I just was. And then another impulse takes me someplace I didn't exactly know where it would go, but then I experience that impulse and sense where it could go from there. And so it just kind of keeps unfolding through an impulse, registering the experience of it, and then feeling the next impulse. Now, the contact part of it points at that because you can improvise individually, or as you already alluded to, an individual human can improvise with the ground or with other objects or in different kinds of spaces than even formal ones like studios and stages. You can improvise anywhere.
You said to us in class that you are dancing as you open the fridge.
Right. And that's sort of an idea like that is a philosophical outgrowth of experiences of what it's like to live with a kind of curiosity and sensory awareness, an openness to something different than maybe it's always been or my habit, and a playfulness. I think there's always at the core of it a sense of play, and by which I think we use this word play when we are aware that we're doing something that is more than necessary or more than functional, and that as Stuart Brown, who is a doctor who founded a thing called the National Institute for Play, it's like this purposeful purposelessness. And humans and other animals demonstrate that there is something important or valuable for the experimentalism that unfolds when we're just in a play stance and we're not trying to achieve already known or functional ends, but he also discovers that we are not actually very happy, healthy, well-functioning, or creative, even antisocial, if we don't have adequate play. This purposeful purposelessness seems to actually be necessary for us to do things that aren't just purely for functional tasks.
It's where the word it's where the word improvisation comes in there, I imagine. It makes me think of the word ludic also, which we've lost a bit in English. We have ludicrous, which is to be ridiculous. But ludic, at least in the Spanish, it exists to refer to a state of play, or it's almost like it's an interrogative attitude towards reality that takes away its importance also, as an invitation to play.
I think that's lovely. Thank you, actually, for this new insight, because I didn't know ludic. But the word ludicrous, interestingly, sounds like not a good thing in English. That's not a thing a person wants to be called, because it seems to imply a loss of anything valuable or important.
Silliness.
And ludicrous, yeah, I guess silliness is among the more appealing sounding things, because it can also be used to denote something we think is frivolous or unimportant or even insane. Or so, but I think that is actually an attitude that maybe too many of us regard play with. Like, well, that's something that children do. We grow up and we have to kind of grow out of. But and the idea of play can be very broad. I think reading novels and watching movies are forms of play. We seem to need and even thrive on the activation in our nervous system, the novelty that it activates, the new possibilities that seem to spark and open. I think we need ways to get us out of rut and to create new possibility. There's this new idea circulating now we call neural plasticity. And we seem to understand that there's something valuable about a brain that can think novel thoughts. But if we only use it to do trained things, then it gets harder and harder, it seems, to even use the full richness of our plasticity or capacity for creative change. And I think play is essential to keep that part of us flexible.
Sure. Trained being sort of the opposite there of play, to do something in a routine, as you said. In that way, contact invites us to climb the stairs differently, to take a step back as you're going forwards, to take a jump on the sidewalk, to shake someone's hand, but then also to shake their foot, to alter.
To open the refrigerator, as you kind of remembered me telling stories of, like, just normal house tasks. For me, are opportunities to disrupt a habitual body set. There's a thing we know in Alexander technique, which is that we develop well-grooved habits of behavior and thought, and those are often actually linked. So if I establish lots of movement, physical task routines, and I seem to do everything the same way every time I do it, that grooves a more deeply rutted pathway in my brain from I want my coffee to what I do to get it. And along with deeply rutted pathways of movement, our brain that also is responsible for social interactions and creative ideas and thoughts and problem solving also can get kind of ossified and solidified in routine patterns, making it more difficult to actually come up with a new idea when one is needed. So I personally find that my creative imagination, my ideas, are more alive and active if I keep my body flexibly interacting with the world around me. So I'll make little playful games of building a sandwich, kind of bending the time, or slowing down certain actions, or adding an unnecessary extra pathway for the
you're playing
for the bread coming from the bag to the plate. More than necessary things, but every time you interrupt a routine, you spark the brain into aliveness again. And there was a thing that I learned from a woman at Harvard named Ellen Langer, who studies, the word she uses is mindfulness, but it's kind of different than the mindfulness that is nicely emerging in culture around meditation practices. But for her, the word is really, really simple. It's notice new things, do things in new ways. So she's run numerous experiments of getting people with well-trained patterns that are grooved and really solid, like a classical musician. And Ellen Langer did this elegant study of asking classical musicians she got a group of them, and the prompt to all of them was, play a piece of music that you know and you like and you think you play well. And then the experiment divided along one follow-up comment, which was, and think in one group, think of the time you played it the best, and try to play it like that again. And the other group got told, but this time play it differently in ways that are subtle and only you would know. Make it new. And what she found there in that study, and many others like it, was just this subtle little tweak and shift from I'm trying to do it the same way to I'm making it new in subtle ways that only I would know. Put people in a slightly little play state, a little bit of improvisation. And then when she played these recordings for people who knew nothing of the experiment, overwhelmingly, listeners preferred the recordings of the Make It New group.
The human group.
So, yeah, like now you're alive and you're responsive, you're actually listening. And even a classical piece of music that's absolutely set and they have made trained to be reliable. From that base of training, they also found the option for riding it with nuanced variation that gave it back its liveness. It wasn't crazy and going anywhere it wanted to go, like a wide open improv, but just playing it with that even hint of improvising it made it more appealing and attractive to listeners. And the musicians themselves claimed to enjoy it more too.
I appreciate the part that you mentioned where the researcher primed them into improvisation, you could say, or reminded them that was a possibility. In general, we avoid improvisation and have so much fun watching others do it because it's terrifying. It's very scary to not have a plan. I know this personally, as do many folks, including with the questions I have here for you. I don't want to have to read them. That's boring. It's quite dull. I would prefer to just see where this goes, but that is to just somersault in a way, which is also very, very thrilling, of course, but it's a dare in general to improvise.
It is, and it seems like people, like you described, people often largely feel fear of improvising, and I kind of wonder how that happens to us. When do we become afraid, and what are we afraid of? I'm tempted to blame our education system.
Always.
Because why not? Let's do that. Because there's a good deal that happens in that progression of kind of training us to produce right answers. So, in mathematics, in language and grammar, in so many subjects, there's a long phase of the learning process through elementary education, before you get to like graduate level where maybe you can start to think new ideas. But there's a long foundation we're building that we're just trying to get a person fluid with their multiplication tables and whatnot. And so there are certain kinds of knowledge that there are right and wrong answers, depending on the theme. And I think students probably internalize a great deal of fear of wrong answers. And the other thing that we do in testing in education is to say that not knowing an answer is also a wrong answer. So, like, what does that say to us in our nervous system, that not knowing is wrong? And what if instead, we're facing a world with a great deal of challenge, and we're going to need people who can come up with novel approaches. The same old way is what got us here. It's not going to get us out of these dilemmas we face. We're going to need some creativity. We're going to need some curiosity. I fear that good chunks of education actually make people afraid of wonder.
The answers are not in the system, certainly.
Mm.
And novelty is necessary to problem solve some of the challenges that you're naming. And they're multiple. But a dose of improvisation is necessary there, you might say.
I would, and you alluded to me as a philosopher, which isn't actually my training or my profession. It seems to be something you feel about me. And I guess I would say if you think so, it's because I've got a lot of thoughts that have emerged over time from these seemingly bodily activities like improvising movement and improvising movement with another person like this conversation, but tactile and changing and not knowing where it's going to go. And I think more of what we think of as ideas and thoughts do also have their foundation in bodily experience. Maybe we forget that by the time we're very cognitive and very intellectual. We don't recognize or still feel the ground of that knowledge. And so then we think that the only way to think about things is to think about things. But I have found that moving my body in relationship, in interaction, is an incredibly interesting and fruitful way to think about things. And it's like sourcing your body as a reference or as an oracle, or it's got some of the deepest, most ancient knowledge we are that we easily take for granted when we think fancier thoughts.
Vessel is often a word used to describe the body these days,
Mm.
which includes the concept of encapsulating, to contain a lot, but it's also something with which you journey and voyage.
Everything that we call mind was built through a full sensory motor interface with the world around us.
So the world around us, I'm glad you went there. I would love to ask you about some of the work you do with the natural world. You dance with trees, which is a beautiful thing to do. An odd one to some who have not heard of this practice. I'd like to ask you about that. And I'd like to read something here from a writer that you turned me on to, whose name is David Abram. He wrote The Spell of the Sensuous, and he has a number of beautiful phrases in that book about the history of language and how it was born in relationship to the world. He says, "We are human only in contact and conviviality with what is not human." What does that mean?
Well, to me, that means that, like to know what anything is, it needs to come into contact with otherness. Like, how do I know what myself is except through relational comparison with others? So if I know myself to be male, it's because I've encountered female or non-binary or something else, right? So we actually, through a lifespan, keep kind of finding our own boundaries and our own identities when we come up against otherness. And I find it so intriguing that so many people feel threatened by otherness when paradoxically it's the otherness that gives us self. And the more otherness we encounter, if we travel the world, if we meet different kinds of people, we get to know people really different from us, chances are we know ourselves better. We get more self when we have more contact. And so for me, that just also includes other entities of the world, living or inanimate, trees, rocks. I like the world as a surface and as a place to feel my body against. If I'm Like I know my body differently when it's up against stone, and I can feel my warmth and softness only because it's hard and cold. Or I feel grass and I feel more solid than that. Or as I alluded before, moving through water, I feel my own density in relationship. So the more environments, the more people, the more surfaces that I put my body into direct contact with, the more I come to understand myself and how I function and what my relationship is.
One of the objects that we touch in contact improv is others.
Mhm.
It's a piece of the program of the teaching of the class that um, I'm not sure what things were like in the 1970s, but in this day and age, touch is a troubled thing. It's
Mhm.
it's fraught. It's been a source of pain, and
Mhm.
we forget how it can also be sometimes a place of possibility.
Mhm.
You have several papers published. One of them has to do with studying the effects of contact improv as therapy for certain populations, in particular with people who have Parkinson's in this
Wow.
case. And there are many interesting findings from that study. It's the first to study contact improv's therapeutic potential. Um, one of the findings, and it's a casual finding, as you know, I'll read from the conclusion. During our workshop, several participants casually reported, and these are folks with Parkinson's who were recruited for the study, they casually reported that the physical contact was among contact improv's main value to them, whereas touch is diminished in their lives. The researchers add, contact improv offers an activity that provides such a high dose of mutual human contact that is not inherently combative or sexual. I appreciate that those are the two options in general of what it's an understatement, right? But those are not certainly not the only two options for touch these days. But they appreciated the touch that came from it. What is it like to teach a course that's based on touch?
Well, as you alluded to, it's something that we have to approach with respect for things that you mentioned. There are touch is far too commonly an experience of trauma for people. And those traumas can exist on a spectrum, right? So it's not like there's some clear and dramatic line that is traumatic. If it feels uncomfortable, then that seems to signal that there's something challenging us. It's not pleasure. It's could be pain that we're experiencing in when we imagine or encounter another human being. And so you have to approach that with a great deal of respect for who other people are, the life experiences they may have, their own fears. And then what I always hope is that through this practice, and there are others too, but in this one in particular, that is so vividly and explicitly about human beings are going to come into contact. And it's not going to be a fight. And it doesn't automatically mean that there's some sort of sexual intimacy. It actually beautifully offers a whole range to fill up that vast gap between violence and sex that too often characterizes what happens when human beings come into contact with each other, and gives us a way to actually just make it natural and normal and conversant instead of loaded up with so many of those things that seem to make it fearful and traumatic.
Different types of pleasure that go beyond, of course, in this case, the sexual. I recently heard someone mention they love people who, to ask you to get out of the way, place their hand on your back to say, excuse me, to pass through on an airplane aisle, for example, or wherever it might be. That this person appreciates that type of touch, they said. Uh,
Hmm.
it certainly is something new to experience in a contact improv class, because you are body to body with people. You're not just, holding hands.
Hmm.
Your backs are against each other, or you're sliding through the floor together.
Hmm.
It's a lot. Um,
It is, and I'll say, because again, I've been teaching this class at Washington University to college students, the same age bracket, for almost 30 years. And, this is just my anecdotal evidence, nothing I've measured, but my sense is that we have gotten more squeamish about it than we were in the 90s and the 2000s. That human beings, for also legitimate reasons that we are acknowledging with respect, we've gotten highly sensitive about it. And I'd say that among the risks of just giving in to our sensitivities and fears and avoiding touch is that it will only continue to amplify the problem of the inadequacy of healthy touch that is
is there
available to people in life.
is there a strategy we can work on to renew that trust? It seems like that's something that's missing there.
Yes, there are, I can say that in the broad art form of dance, as I've experienced it in the 40 years I've been involved in it, um, we come from maybe a moment in the 70s and 80s when people are being casual and comfortable and loose. And, there's a sense of the, the cohort of people that I came into dance with seemed to be incredibly audaciously comfortable with our bodies. And so it was just kind of a norm in dance that people were going to partner each other. There was going to be a lot of contact just to do the artwork, whether it was contact improv or not. There's a lot of physical contact when groups of human beings make this artwork. So it was just a thing that I don't know if people were also uncomfortable but pretending to be cool with it, or if people were actually more at ease. That's hard to say.
Sure.
I'd say that today, I don't know if human beings are actually different today, or if we're just actually mindfully and respectfully bringing out more of how people actually feel. Hard to say. Um, but there is much more sensitivity around touch than there was decades ago, often for valid reasons. And again, my one question is, but could we, in our sensitivity and respect, actually just keep reducing the kinds of experiences that would help us to become comfortable with our bodies and with each other, help us to heal traumas if we knew that there were spaces we trust and people we trust. So in dance, there's a growing effort to be open with issues of consent. That at one moment, teaching a class like this, we just go, and it's kind of immersion method. It's like, I know you're uncomfortable. Let's just do this until we're not. And that's, we're all taking a lot of new consideration of how do we approach that and how do we invite people to agree and consent to the process so that you're not throwing them in a deep end and
Uh,
trusting that they'll swim.
Another of the main findings or objectives, well, the touch was not an objective of this study, but it's something that was commented on ultimately. One of the things you were trying to study was if dance could be a proper intervention with folks who have limited mobility. Um,
Mm.
the outcome measures were disease severity, balance, and gait, meaning the way they walked 1 week before and after the workshop. Falling
Mm.
is a pretty important part of contact, and it seems like that's something that can
Mm.
be applied from this practice as perhaps as well from other dance practices. You'll have to let me know. What is there to be learned in dance about falling?
Yeah, that's a huge subject for me, and that study that you're referring to with the people with Parkinson's was particularly revealing to me of this thing that maybe I even was taking for granted about my contact improv and modern dance training. Modern dance, preceding contact improv in particular, modern dance had been, let's say, in response or reaction or opposition to other form like ballet, was really claiming the ground as a movement artistic venue. If ballet was poised and floating and light and ethereal and upward as if ascending to heaven, modern dance claimed the earth and our mortality and our, you know, our relationship to gravity as not just a problem not just an error to avoid. Falling was made an art form. So I come from that tradition in my training, lots of dance techniques that explicitly operate on the ground. That's the intention. Again, not a mistake that happened, but something you've done with skill and importance. But it was, in a way, it wasn't even really until I did this study with the people with Parkinson's that I came to fully appreciate what that means. For them, as for many fully functional, normal people, falling down is a risk, a fear, an embarrassment, a failure, and potentially injurious and life-threatening.
It's the worst thing that can happen in improvisation is for you to fall, metaphorically as well.
Well, it depends. In contact improv, falling isn't among the worst things that can happen. It's actually among the most fun and generative of possibilities. So when you actually embrace and just start to get more interested and capable and fluid, we don't train it by doing repeated movements in and out of the ground. We train it by experimenting gradually, falling, like sitting up and then falling into the floor and then coming up to our knees and falling and trying to fall in as many different ways as possible so that you've trained, but not just one rote pathway. Instead, you've laid a foundation of capacity to respond variably to being off balance and the need to land something that, took you on a ride and, you either needed or wanted to ride the ground. For the people with Parkinson's, among the things that they reported was that, as soon as they got their diagnosis, almost all of them said their doctors said explicitly to them, so be careful and don't fall. And what kind of came to the surface for all of us during that 2-week workshop with them was kind of started to float out for our reconsideration and awareness that maybe that's a terrible strategy, that normal gait, normal balance for healthy people we take for granted, that normal movement, just walking around, is a series of smoothly recovered falls. Every step you take is at a moment in a state of release, and then your foot gets there ahead of you to smooth out the recovery of it. Modern dance artist Doris Humphrey had named this fall in recovery. It was part of her artwork. And so that's a lineage that leads to people like the contact improv founders who, building on this idea that, falling is actually a normal part of the arc of life. It's that state where we're actually alive. So then it even becomes philosophical. Doris called it the arc between two deaths. There's a before we're alive and there's an after we're alive in stillness and rest. But life is this arc, just like the moment that I lean forward into my next step. There's a moment there where I am off balance. And mostly we don't notice that unless our foot gets caught and we can't get it there to catch us. That's when we know we're falling.
I'm off balance and everything is possible.
Right. Then there's that possibility that if you are not treating the fall as a risk of error or failure, but actually as a whole new milieu for movement and capacity and artwork and skill, there's much that opens up as a capacity of life.
This is why I say that it's philosophy as well. This dance practice, it certainly dabbles in instructions about much more than just movement, or rather tries to see movement through the world as a dance. That's the part that for me was most enabling, freeing, to think that you're walking, but this can also be more than just that. You can, yes, go to the store, but how will you grab that carton of milk from the shelf? Will you just do it, or will you really do it? Will you grab it differently this time?
Well, I would say, will you experience it? We seem to like routines because they're comforting. And so a lot of people proceed with their days to try to get it so that I don't have to think about what I'm doing. I can just do it efficiently and with reduced risk of error. But that approach leads to a mindset of mindlessness, and we're operating our bodies in space, even dangerously like driving cars, with a degraded and a lowered awareness of the experience of it. Some of that's right, because there are certain situations you don't really want to have to think, what am I doing and how do I do it? So you got to get driving to a plane where it's kind of automatic and your response is intuitive. But we also don't want it to get so routine that you can't perceive something different happening, like a car coming in front of you. You're not responding. So somehow I think the goal of dance and driving in life is to accumulate skills, but not until you're mindless of them, but so that we can now bring our full experiential mindfulness to the joy of it happening, and with the still open-ended flexibility to make adjustments when needed. Whether that's, getting out of the way of a car, avoiding an accident, to getting our headlong bent into climate change, to take a new direction. So somehow we need to be able to perceive that something is changing, and we're mindful and awake and responsive to actually adapt to that, not over-reliant on routines. The people with Parkinson's find themselves with a degrading motor control, but also having lived too mindlessly routine. What we did in that 2 weeks with them was to explicitly challenge them with the risk of falling, the very thing they were told to avoid, and said, well, let's do it. Let's actually risk the fall and wake us back up. And if it had measurable improvement in their balance, I would probably argue that most of that was that they got a little more comfortable again with their body being in that live, movable, adaptive state, and that they were more present to the experience of their bodies moving instead of afraid and retreating from it.
Sure. I wonder if you have a small task, to not say a small dance, that you can give listeners to try contact improv wherever they are.
Well, a game that I like to play, just to wake myself up or disrupt the routine, I call Dance Everything. or dance anything. Now, you have to kind of first sort of ask, well, what do we mean by dance? There's many examples of people doing rhythmic things that, we kind of know what dancing is. From my modern dance tradition, again, of people exploring and creating all new kinds of styles, from rhythmic things like we commonly recognize as dancing to incredibly pedestrian actions have also been offered and presented in performance as dancing. So I get to draw from this really big, huge lineage of examples in which literally any kind of movement you can think of or do could be artwork, if you think so, if you decide it's so, if you do it like you mean it. So from that lens, I'm basically making a game of, if I want to pick up this tea mug and I want to bring into the action some qualities that I understand as within the range of my artistic latitudes, right? I can take a normal movement and I could warp its time. I could make it slower or faster. Or I could do it with a little more effort than the normal, or a little less effort than the normal. Or again, I could just pick up the mug and normal and bring it to my mouth to drink, or I could give it an extra little loop around first.
Caution with hot beverages.
Caution with hot beverages. But objects in general, just the chores you have to do. Like, notice this word. Oh, I have to do the chores. And the word itself, even though we're probably on some neutral level, it just means the tasks we do to clean the house. But the word chores has become so onerous.
It's a chore.
It's a chore. We mean it more than just a thing I do to clean my house. We mean it as something I don't want to do and is a burden. And part of the burden of it, I think mostly the burden, is that we have to do this thing we think is uninteresting in an absolutely mundane and joyless way. And both of those things are choices. So the contact improv game, I would offer that, you can Google contact improv and see what it looks like as an art form. Graceful bodies tumbling around and over each other in spontaneous flow. But for me, and maybe even in the pandemic course that you were part of, revealed to me that contact improv, more philosophically and broadly speaking, is a way of interacting with our world in a novel and fresh way, a way of bringing aesthetics. Like, why do I have to clean my house in a mindless and boring and onerous way? Can't I make it intentional? Can't I experience the actions as something beautiful? And what do I do to make it more beautiful if it isn't? I think it's just the mindlessness that leads us to that feeling that things are boring. Things aren't boring. It's just us.
The everything dance.
We get too routine and everything, and things seem boring, but it's really just our routined approach that is no longer interesting and alive. Tweak it, dance it. Just adjust the timing or the mindset or the outlook, or even just enjoy the sensation of an object moving across the room, the flow of the world around us optically, and we can make it more beautiful and more enjoyable.
And that's always accessible. I appreciate that. Is there anything I haven't asked you?
I don't know.
That's okay.
I don't know what we don't know.
Ooh. That's okay. There doesn't need to be another question. I have a few more for you, just a speed round. Before we go to that last segment, if you've enjoyed today's conversation and you have 10 seconds, please rate, subscribe, or follow. And David, a couple final questions. What's your secret to having great hair?
Um, I don't harass it any more than necessary. I don't stress it. I don't, like color it. I don't, harass it with heater chemicals. I don't strip it with soaps too deeply. I just try to mostly let it be. How
A
about
skill.
you?
Me, I don't know if I have a secret. I also try to not harass it for sure. Um,
Mhm.
and I don't wash it every day. Maybe those are important secrets.
Same, same.
A skill you're currently working on.
Mm. Oh, being more at ease with aging. I think I've got a lot of identity wrapped up in my youthful skills and abilities. And it's beginning and going to keep changing. There's, no avoiding that. But I try to think less about loss of ability and more like trying to identify what my shifting values are, what I think is beautiful about the change in my movement, maybe getting subtler and slower. In my youth, speed and agility were more possible. And in my current artwork, I am really slowing down. But interestingly, I've been asking college student performing dancers to go on this journey with me. We've been making a series of dances that are very slow. And there seems to be something really resonating for people. My guess is that the world is too fast and accelerating, and we feel too much stress and anxiety about that. And so I try to, use my position as the leader of a room to just make people slow down long enough until they can actually feel the beauty of it, till they can, there almost always comes up some sort of like frustration or anxiety about like how slow it feels until you break through and then you realize, oh, this is nice. This feels right.
You wrote somewhere that in Frontiers, in the publication Frontiers, witnessing a person moving at the edge of their ability, whatever that may be, is what is most beautiful to me. It sounds like that's the skill you're trying to embody now as well. That's beautiful. Two more questions for you.
Mm.
Uh, what is your go-to drink?
Oh, well, water first, because and again, as you age, drying out is one of the things you will feel quickly in your joints and in your muscles and your brain function. So I am much, much more sensitive to these subtle changes in my body. Water has to be more regular than I think I used to be with that. But then after that, probably my double shot of espresso.
Nice. If you could
Then occasion,
rename yourself any name,
I don't know, I'm uncomfortable with naming myself something. Um, it's probably why I've never bothered to try to do that. I don't know. I like my name. My name, David Marchant. The name David means beloved, which my mother taught me. And I like that quality. I like not just being beloved, but the outlook and the quality of beloved, perceiving the world and others this way. And then my last name, if you take it literally as a French word, means walking.
that's
So
right.
my name kind of means beloved walking.
Beautiful. A song or album that you'd recommend?
Mm. Um, Brian Eno's Apollo, and best listened to on vinyl if possible.
Small ask. I appreciate that. I appreciate all that you've shared. Thank you for coming on today.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for being here. If this conversation resonated with you, consider reviewing Therapy for the World or sharing the link with someone who might appreciate it. Until next time, speak with care and listen deeply.